Welcome to Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton Short, Professor of Geography at the George Washington University and Chief Reader of Advanced Placement Human Geography. Join us as Dr. Short interviews Dr. Parag Khanna, geostrategist, world traveler, and best-selling author, discussing central concepts in the AP Human Geography curriculum through the lens of his new book, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. This discussion series is brought to you by the American Geographical Society, the foremost champion of geography for the benefit of society since 1851. And now, over to Dr. Lisa Benton Short.
Welcome back, geographers. I'm Lisa Benton Short here with having a great conversation with Parag Khanna, and we today are going to talk about cities and urban land use patterns and processes. And I'm an urban geographer, so this is the unit that is near and dear to my heart. And I want to start with a graph. So, a significant major shift in the way humanity has lived on this planet since it began occurred in 2010, where we went from 50% urban and 50% rural to 51% urban. This is really a long trajectory. The 20th century has been described as the third revolution, the urban revolution. And throughout most of the 20th century, urbanization has been increasing. By the time we hit 2010, we had just flipped over and become a majority of urban livers, dwellers on this planet. So the future of the world looks pretty urban at the moment. About 56% of the world's population, about 4.3 billion people, live in cities and urban areas. So is urbanization and living in cities our destiny, Parag?
Oh, Lisa, I mean, I'm also so fascinated by this, and it's another reason why this graph you have right here is yet another reason why it's such an exciting time to be alive and studying geography, because of these major inflection points that tell us so much about ourselves and how we live in this world and how different this moment is from the past and how different it might be in the future. So this map that looks at the world's megacity clusters is so important that it's also the one behind my head. I've got a large size one on my wall. Now, what's so remarkable about this urbanization paradigm, it's not only that the majority of the human population lives in cities, but what cities themselves have become. Because on the maps that most of us have on our walls at school or in our offices, cities are just black dots. And those black dots are all the same size, more or less. But in the real world, some cities have become so large, physically, spatially, that they are more like archipelagos, right? They're so big you can see them from space. They're not just little black dots. So what I've highlighted here with these ovals are some of the roughly 50 kind of mega city clusters that have the largest populations in the whole world. Some of them are really so large that they almost fuse together with their neighbors. There's quite a few examples of them. In Japan, actually, roughly 65–70% of the Japanese population lives in one massive urban archipelago that stretches from Tokyo to Osaka, right? It's not one city, it's many cities, right? The Pearl River Delta in southern China, which is now called the Greater Bay Area, stretches from Guangzhou all the way down to Hong Kong, Shenzhen, closer to Hong Kong. So again, it's a cluster of a dozen cities that increasingly acts like one integrated unit. Abu Dhabi and Dubai are two different emirates in the UAE, but many people now refer to it as Abu Dubai. It could be the first place where you have a hyperloop connecting two different cities, but it's going to blend them together even more because it'll shorten the travel time between them. And on you see around the world with these mega city clusters. So the fact that the world is urban is one thing, but that cities have reached a scale where if you take the Chongqing Chengdu urban cluster, the super cluster as they call it in China, its population is about 80 million people. Let's bear in mind that is more people than all of Germany which is the largest country in all of Europe. So again, going back to one of our earlier units, cities can be more important than countries. The GDP size, the economic value of some of these cities is not only the majority of the economy of the entire country that they are in, but it can be larger than the GDP of many other countries in the world. So that is the gravity, the scale, the importance, the density of cities in the world today. So one outstanding question, though, is, of course, yes, the world will be urban. Yes, we as humans seem to prefer urban life. But what will these cities look like in the future, especially given their enormous scale? And here I just want to point out, when you think about those clusters, those archipelagos of cities, they're not very uniform. They're very different. And you and I, Lisa, both spent a lot of time in these cities around the world. And, in one neighborhood, it can feel like the image on the upper right, which is Midtown, Manhattan, right? Modern, urban, skyscrapers, financial district, pretty clean, right? Another neighborhood could just be the industrial hub, where you've got belching smokestacks and factories. You might also have vast, endless tenements for housing in a whole other area. And then, of course, slums, people living in shacks. And so on and so on. So what cities are coming to look like is kind of like what we had in the Middle Ages. They're very stratified. Every district or zone can have a very different feel, even though you're technically in the same quote unquote city. So that's some of the trends just when we look at the mega cities. But of course, there's other dynamics and phenomenon going on there too when it comes to cities. And of course, where people go and what kinds of places people go to is also very interesting. What are you seeing, Lisa, in that regard? What kinds of cities do people prefer, or how, simply put, can city builders or mayors get the city right, given how challenging it is to govern cities with tens of millions of people?
Yeah, it's interesting that we come up with new vocabulary words to kind of capture these new spatial phenomena, right? So we have megalopolis and mega regions. We have metacities of 20 million and megacities of 10 million. As we've developed these vocabularies because they're just these, they're these new, new spatial phenomena. And of course, for cities, governance, and excuse me, urban planners, these are incredibly challenging places. And so we get cities that oftentimes have a blend of all of these images that you have here in one major urban area. Like I'm just thinking of Rio. Has industrial production. It has its finance capitalism. It has its favelas, its slums. It has major services, and it's very connected within Brazil to other major urban areas. And planning and connecting people within these cities is a major challenge. And I think one of the interesting things is, when we're talking about the embracing of sustainability, the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, there's actually a standalone goal for sustainable cities, because I think there's a recognition that with cities of such large size and complexity, that dealing with some of these unsustainable practices is really critical. So one of the things I want to ask you, Parag, is what's been driving urbanization? How are we getting such major, huge size cities that are megacities and metacities?
Well, as the world population has grown, and we've seen the concentration of economic activity in cities, that's what has driven people to be economic migrants, if you will, into cities. So the largest migration in the world, for example, in the last 40 years, has actually been Chinese people moving from rural areas out to the coastal cities, where you've had so much economic activity, and China has become, the factory floor of the world in industry as a result of that concentration of investment that has drawn the rural workforce in. And the same thing is happening in South Asia, particularly in India and in other parts of the world. So we are by nature economic migrants as people, especially in the last 100 years. And that doesn't mean you have to cross a border, because the shift in your quality of life or in your economic opportunity from a rural area to an urban area in your same country can be as profound as crossing any border. But the question is, can it be done sustainably? Which was the point that you were making earlier. Can we have smart cities, if you will? And like you said, there's so much new vocabulary and nomenclature. And one of those terms is indeed smart city that we hear more and more. And in a smart city, what are we trying to do? Well, we want to localize our energy production. We don't want to have oil or gas pipelines anymore. We want solar power, wind power, hydrogen power. All of those things are happening and being tested right now. As we mentioned in the previous unit, we don't want to import all our food from all over the world. How can we grow it locally using technology, using hydro and aquaponic production, and minimizing the water resources necessary for that food? What can we do to make our buildings, which are one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, how can we make them carbon neutral? How can we, use solar power for those buildings, and many other techniques that are being deployed by architects today to reduce the ecological footprint of cities. And on it goes. And the smart city is originally, 10 years ago when people started using this term, they often meant we'll build new cities from scratch and have them be hyper efficient. But then we realized that, wait a minute, you're not going to move 5 billion people to new cities. We have to make every city in the world today a smart city. Every city right now, wherever it is, has to deploy the technology, make the effort, make the investment to be greener. So I guess the question, Lisa, is it going to work? Do you think it's happening fast enough? Cities are the engines of progress and where people are moving, and they reflect who we are, a desire to be urban, but they're also the locus of greenhouse gas emissions and industrial activity that is devastating for the planet. So it's a race between those two aspects of the city. And I wonder what your view is on which will prevail.
Well, it's definitely true that cities account for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we want to address climate change, if we want to move to a more sustainable future, we have to really focus on how we can reduce non-renewable energy use in our major cities around the world. And I think that is a major challenge. And it also, I want to just show an image that maybe is a little bit less optimistic than the image that you showed about kind of a smart city of the future. This is actually what could happen. These are geographers that have used the 8-foot sea level rise that may happen by about 2100 if we are not able to curb greenhouse gas emissions and reduce what's in the atmosphere. This is an image of what Lower Manhattan might look like in 2100. So for all of these efforts around sustainability and trying to plan a smart city, if we don't really take action on climate change, some of our cities and some of those big megacities that you had a map of, Parag, are all low-lying coastal cities. It's something close to, I want to say 2 billion people are living in coastal city areas that are prone to flooding. And we may see this kind of a more pessimistic urban future. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I want to end it with a positive note, and that is to ask you, can we avoid a situation that looks like this?
We certainly can through a number of means. I mean, one is to try to mitigate climate change, to reduce the pace of greenhouse gas emissions, even to reverse their impact or stall it through things like geoengineering, right? To inject sulfur particles into the atmosphere and redirect sunlight, or other kinds of ways of capturing carbon and storing carbon in underground, so that we can try to decelerate, slow down climate change. But the truth is that it's not actually a rubber band that snaps back, right? The ecosystem, the climate is a very complex system. And so whatever comes next is not going to be what it was. It'll be something different. The question is it something that we can live with or not? And that brings us back to cities in the sense that if indeed places like Bangkok or Jakarta or Dhaka and even New York City or Mumbai, are going to have to grapple with a scenario like this, it doesn't mean that we won't need to keep studying and thinking about cities. Because the truth is that over the thousands of years of civilization, the most important cities have changed over time. And as people move, they build new cities. So one of the things for the young geographers of the world today to be thinking about is, if the worst case scenario that we're seeing here comes to pass, where should they think about people migrating to? And where will they need to build the cities of the future in further higher elevation, different latitudes? What are the most optimal geographies for us to build stable settlements and habitats for the world population if our current ones can't be livable anymore?
That's a great provocative question. I think it's going to be the work of students in AP Human Geography as they kind of get into their careers of the future, maybe to help us plan and solve some of those challenging questions about what will urbanization look like in the next century. So I'm going to wrap up here, and thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you in our next conversation, which is looking at economic processes and patterns.
Thank you for joining us for this segment of Short Takes on Geography with Dr. Lisa Benton Short. Tune in for this and more great geography teaching resources at americangeo.org. Until next time.